When I slid into his bed, I could feel his body tense under my touch. This was supposed to be just a game, but he couldn't hide his true desires. And that's when I realized I had his life in my hands. I never thought I'd do something like this. But when my mom left for her business trip, leaving me alone with Richard, her perfect husband, I knew it was my chance to uncover the truth. His eyes lingered on me just a little too long. His touches felt a little too accidental. And deep down, I knew, behind that charming smile and kind words, there was something darker. The storm that night gave me the perfect excuse. The rain slammed against the windows, thunder shook the walls, and the flashes of lightning lit up the dark corners of our house. I crept down the hall, my heart racing, not from fear of the storm, but from what I was about to do. I stopped in front of his door, hesitated for just a second, then knocked softly. "Richard," I whispered, my voice trembling just enough to sound believable. "I'm scared. Can I stay with you tonight?" I could hear him moving inside, his footsteps slow as they approached the door. For a moment, there was silence. Then the door creaked open, and there he was, standing in the dim light, wearing just a t-shirt and pajama pants. His eyes softened when he saw me, but there was something else there too, something I'd seen before but couldn't quite name. "Of course," he said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. I walked into his room, my bare feet silent on the carpet. The room smelled like his cologne, clean, sharp, and a little too strong. I climbed into the bed, pulling the blanket up around me like a scared little girl. He hesitated for a second, standing by the door, as if debating whether this was a good idea. But then he turned off the light and slid into bed beside me. That's when I felt it, the tension in his body, the stiffness in his shoulders. He was trying to act normal, but I could feel the heat radiating off him. This wasn't just me imagining things. This was real. And now, I had him exactly where I wanted. At first, we just lay there in silence, the sound of the storm filling the room. Thunder rumbled, and I let out a small, fake whimper. I felt him shift beside me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I nodded, but I didn't move away. Instead, I let my arm brush against his, just lightly, just enough to see what he'd do. He didn't pull away. My heart was pounding, but not from fear. I was testing him, pushing the limits. And he was failing. Minutes felt like hours. The storm raged outside, but the real tension was inside that room. I could feel his breathing change, becoming slower, heavier. I knew what was going through his mind. I turned toward him, pretending to seek comfort. "Richard," I whispered, my voice soft and vulnerable, "thank you for letting me stay." He mumbled something, but I wasn't really listening. I was focused on his body, on the way he stiffened every time I moved closer. This wasn't just a stepfather comforting his stepdaughter. This was something else entirely. And the more I pushed, the more obvious it became. I could feel his heartbeat through the mattress, fast and uneven. I could feel the warmth of his skin, the slight tremble in his fingers when he adjusted the blanket. I smiled to myself in the darkness. He thought he was in control. He thought he could hide it. But I saw everything. As the night dragged on, I knew I had him trapped. But what I didn't know was how far he'd go. Because that was just the beginning. What happened next? Let's just say, the storm outside wasn't the only thing about to explode. The morning light crept through the thin curtains, casting faint golden stripes across the room. I felt it before I saw it, Richard's hand resting too close to my waist, his fingers barely brushing against my skin. My heart thudded in my chest, louder than the storm from the night before. I froze, listening to his slow, steady breathing. He was still asleep. I carefully slid out from under the blanket, holding my breath as I moved. His body shifted slightly, a quiet sigh escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. Barefoot, I tiptoed back to my room, closing the door behind me with a soft click. I pressed my back against it, my heart pounding like a war drum. Last night was supposed to be a game, but now, it felt like something much bigger. I glanced at the clock, 7:12 a.m. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors settling beneath the weight of the morning. I splashed cold water on my face in the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. What exactly had I started? His behavior wasn't just unsettling, it was confirming everything I had feared. But fear wasn't enough. I needed proof. Breakfast was strange. Richard acted like nothing had happened. He hummed softly to himself as he stood by the stove, flipping an omelet with practiced ease. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, mixing with the buttery aroma of breakfast. But it felt suffocating. "Morning, kiddo," he said cheerfully when I walked in, like we were just two ordinary people in an ordinary house. I forced a smile and sat at the table, my hands clenched tightly in my lap to stop them from trembling. His eyes met mine for a brief second, too long, too knowing, and then he looked away, focusing on the food. He slid a plate in front of me, the omelet perfectly folded, the edges crisp. But I wasn't hungry. Not for food, at least. "Sleep okay?" he asked casually, taking a sip of his coffee. I nodded. "Yeah, thanks." His eyes lingered on me again, just for a moment. There was something in his gaze, something that made my skin crawl. But I held it together. I had to. After breakfast, he announced he was heading to the store to pick up a few things. "You need anything?" he asked, grabbing his keys from the counter. I shook my head. "I'm good. All right. I'll be back in an hour." The door closed behind him, and as soon as I heard his car pull out of the driveway, I sprang into action. I'd never been in Richard's office before. It was his private space, a room Mom always said was off limits. But today, that rule didn't apply. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open. The room smelled like old books and strong coffee, mixed with the faint scent of his cologne, sharp, almost medicinal. The blinds were half drawn, casting long shadows across the room. His desk sat in the middle, neat and organized, just like him. But I knew better. Beneath that polished exterior was something rotten. I moved quickly, my heart pounding in my ears. The top drawer of his desk was locked, as expected. But then I noticed something, a small key tucked beneath a stack of papers on the bookshelf. Amateur move, Richard. I grabbed the key and slid it into the lock. It clicked open with a soft snap. What I found inside made my blood run cold. A box. Just a simple, plain box. But when I opened it, my stomach twisted into knots. Photos. Of me. Not family photos, not casual snapshots. These were taken without my knowledge. Me reading in the backyard, me cooking in the kitchen, me stepping out of the shower with just a towel wrapped around me. The angles were deliberate, invasive. My hands shook as I flipped through them. He'd been watching me. For how long? I felt bile rise in my throat, but I forced it down. I didn't have time for panic. I needed proof. I pulled out my phone and quickly snapped pictures of the photos. Every single one. My fingers moved fast, but my mind was racing even faster. This wasn't just some creepy obsession. This was dangerous. But even with the photos, it wasn't enough. Not yet. I needed something irrefutable. Something he couldn't talk his way out of. I put everything back exactly as I found it, locked the drawer, and returned the key to its hiding spot. Then I stepped out of the office, closing the door softly behind me. My heart was still racing, but there was no turning back now. When Richard came home, I acted like nothing had happened. I even thanked him for the breakfast. His eyes lit up, like he believed he'd won. But I knew better. That night, after dinner, I suggested we watch a movie together in the living room. He agreed, a little too quickly. We sat on opposite ends of the couch at first, but as the movie went on, he inched closer. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. His arm brushed against mine once, then again, lingering just a second longer each time. But I didn't pull away. Let him think he was in control. Halfway through the movie, I excused myself to the bathroom. But instead of heading upstairs, I slipped into his office one more time. This time, I left my phone behind, hidden in the stack of books on his desk, the recording app running. If he made a move, if he said anything, I'd have it all. I returned to the living room, my heart pounding but my face calm. I sat back down, closer this time, pretending to be comfortable, pretending to trust him. The movie played on, but neither of us was really watching. The real game was just beginning. When the credits rolled, Richard finally spoke. "You know," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, "I'm really glad we're getting closer." I turned to him, keeping my expression neutral. "Me too." His eyes darkened, and I saw it, the shift. The moment he let his guard down. But I wasn't going to let mine down. Not yet. As I got up to go to bed, he touched my arm, his fingers lingering just a little too long. "Good night," he said softly, his voice dripping with something I didn't want to name. "Good night, Richard," I replied, my voice steady. I went to my room, locked the door, and retrieved my phone. I replayed the recording, my hands shaking. His words, his tone, the subtle shifts in his voice. It was all there, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. I needed more. I needed undeniable proof, because this wasn't just about catching him. This was about making sure he could never hurt anyone again. Evening crept in slowly, stretching shadows across the walls as Richard lingered in the kitchen, his casual movements feeling anything but casual. I could feel his eyes on me, tracing my every step, though he pretended not to notice. "Hey," he finally said, his voice too light, too rehearsed. "How about we watch a movie tonight? Just the two of us." I looked up from my phone, forcing a smile. "Sure, sounds fun." My heart thudded in my chest, but I kept my face calm. This was exactly what I wanted. The living room was dimly lit, the glow from the TV flickering against the walls. He picked some random thriller, but I wasn't paying attention to the screen. I was watching him. We started at opposite ends of the couch. For the first 15 minutes, he stayed put, acting like everything was normal. But then he shifted, slowly inching closer, like a predator testing the waters. First, his arm brushed against mine when he reached for the remote. Then, his knee lightly bumped against mine when he shifted his position. Each accidental touch lingered a little longer than it should have. I didn't move away. Let him believe I was naive. The more comfortable he felt, the easier it would be to trap him. Halfway through the movie, he leaned closer under the pretense of adjusting the blanket. "You cold?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. I shook my head, giving him a small smile. "I'm fine." But he didn't move back. Instead, he let his arm rest along the back of the couch, his fingers dangerously close to my shoulder. His breathing had changed too, slower, heavier, as if he was waiting for something. I could feel the tension radiating from him. It was thick, suffocating. But I kept my composure, pretending not to notice. The movie played on, but neither of us was really watching. When the credits finally rolled, Richard turned to me, his eyes darker than before. "Want to go for a walk?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was something beneath it, something I couldn't ignore. It was an odd suggestion, but I nodded. "Sure." The cool night air hit me as soon as we stepped outside. The streets were still damp from the earlier rain, and the scent of wet earth mixed with the sharpness of freshly cut grass. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet, as we made our way toward the small park down the street. At first, we walked in silence, our footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. But then he started talking, about Mom, about work, about nothing in particular. But it wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. "You've really grown up," he said suddenly, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "It's strange seeing you like this." His words slid under my skin like ice. I forced a light laugh, trying to sound innocent. "What do you mean?" He stopped walking for a moment, turning to face me. His eyes held mine, and I could see it, the hesitation, the internal battle. But then it was gone, replaced by something darker. Just, "You're not a little girl anymore." I smiled, but inside, my stomach twisted into knots. I could see it in his eyes. He was testing me, seeing how far he could push. But I wasn't going to let him win. Not yet. We walked back home in silence, the tension between us thicker than the humid night air. When we stepped inside, the house felt even quieter than before. It was like the walls themselves were holding their breath. "I'm gonna take a shower," I said casually, turning toward the stairs. But I didn't head to the bathroom. Instead, I slipped into his office. The room was exactly as I'd left it, and neat, orderly, a perfect facade. I moved quickly, my heart pounding in my chest as I pulled out my phone. I opened the recording app and set it on the shelf behind a stack of books, angled just right to capture everything. This was it. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Then I slipped out of the office, closing the door softly behind me. I turned on the shower upstairs, letting the water run as a cover. But I wasn't thinking about the shower. I was thinking about what would happen next. Tonight, he would show his true face, and I'd be ready. The sound of the shower still echoed in my ears as I descended the stairs, heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. I rehearsed the look on my face, calm, casual, like nothing about this evening was out of the ordinary. But inside, the tension coiled tighter, ready to snap. When I stepped into the kitchen, Richard was already there, as if he had been waiting for me. The soft glow from the overhead light cast long shadows on his face, making his features seem sharper, more defined. On the table sat 2 mugs of tea, steam curling lazily into the air. "Thought you might like something warm," he said, his voice smooth, too smooth. He gestured to the chair across from him. That same disarming smile stretched across his face. I took the seat, my fingers wrapping around the warm mug even though I had no intention of drinking. The silence between us was suffocating, heavy with unspoken words. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It was like a standoff, waiting to see who would break the silence first. And then he did. "You know," Richard began, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You're really special." His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. But I didn't flinch. I held his gaze, letting him believe I was hanging on to his every word. "Sometimes," he continued, his fingers tapping lightly against the side of his mug. I feel like you understand me better than anyone else. His words hung in the air, thick and heavy. His hand reached out, his fingertips brushing against mine, lingering just a second too long. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the corners of my mouth twitch into a small, shy smile. Let him think he was in control. But he wasn't. I could feel the shift in the air, the way his confidence grew with every second of my silence. He thought he had me where he wanted. He thought I was falling into his trap. But in reality, he was walking straight into mine. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. The tension between us was a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest touch. Richard leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower. You've grown up so much. It's hard not to notice. I swallowed hard, forcing the heat rising in my chest to stay hidden behind a mask of innocence. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I kept my breathing steady. I should probably get some sleep, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. I stood up slowly, feeling his eyes on me with every movement. He didn't stop me, but as I turned to leave, his hand brushed against my arm, a feather-light touch that sent shivers down my spine. Good night, he murmured, his breath warm against my skin. Good night, Richard, I replied, my voice steady, unwavering. I climbed the stairs, my steps slow and deliberate, but the moment I reached my room and shut the door behind me, the facade cracked. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I fumbled to unlock the screen, pulling up the voice recorder app. I hit play, my breath hitching in my throat as the familiar sounds filled the room. His voice, his words, every disgusting, damning syllable was crystal clear. But it was more than just words. It was the tone, the intent, the lingering touches that spoke volumes. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was evidence. Cold, hard, irrefutable. I sat on the edge of my bed, the weight of what I'd just captured pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. But one thing was clear. Tomorrow, everything would change. The night stretched on, each minute dragging by as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. But beneath the fear was something else, something darker. Satisfaction. I had him. Finally, after all the careful planning, after all the games and manipulation, I had what I needed. The proof that would tear his carefully constructed world apart. But with that satisfaction came a gnawing unease. Because even though I had the evidence, I wasn't sure how far he was willing to go. And I wasn't sure how far I was willing to go to stop him. Morning came too quickly, the pale light of dawn filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. I sat up slowly, my body aching from the tension of the night before. Downstairs, I could hear Richard moving around, the familiar sounds of breakfast being prepared, the clinking of dishes, the soft hum of a tune under his breath. It was like nothing had changed, but everything had. I dressed quickly, shoving the phone deep into my pocket, the weight of it a constant reminder of what I'd captured. As I descended the stairs, I forced a neutral expression onto my face, masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. Richard was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes like it was just another normal day. When he saw me, he smiled, that same too smooth smile that made my skin crawl. Morning, he greeted, his tone light and casual. Sleep well? I nodded, my throat dry. Yeah, thanks. He slid a plate in front of me, the pancakes stacked neatly, syrup drizzled over the top. I stared at them for a moment, my appetite non-existent. But I forced a bite, keeping up the charade just a little longer. Because today, the game wasn't over. But soon, it would be. When Mom came home the next day, I was waiting for her at the door. She looked tired but happy, her face lighting up when she saw me, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Hey, sweetheart, she smiled, stepping inside, her keys gingling as she tossed them onto the table. I missed you. I didn't smile back. Mom, I said, my voice steady, cold. We need to talk. She paused, frowning, sensing the tension in the air. What's wrong? I pulled out my phone from my pocket, my fingers tight around it. My heart was pounding, but I didn't let it show. Just watch this. She took the phone from my hand, confusion etched across her face. I watched as she pressed play, the color draining from her cheeks almost instantly. Richard's voice filled the room, smooth, calculated, disgusting. His words were undeniable, every 6 syllable a nail in the coffin of his perfect facade. Her face went pale, her breath hitching in her throat. But then, just as quickly, her expression changed. Pale turned to red, her cheeks flushing with fury. Her hands trembled, but her eyes burned with a rage I had never seen before. She didn't say a word. Instead, she shoved the phone back into my hands and stormed out the door. I stood there in the silence she left behind, my heart racing as I stared at the door, knowing exactly where she was going. Hours passed, but I didn't move from the spot. The house felt different, heavier, like it was holding its breath. Every tick of the clock echoed through the empty space, each second dragging longer than the last. And then, I heard it. The sound of police sirens in the distance. I didn't smile. Not yet. But I felt the tension in my chest loosen just slightly, like the storm was finally about to break. When the front door opened, Richard was in the kitchen, setting the table for dinner like nothing was wrong, like his world wasn't about to come crashing down. But it was. The knock on the door was sharp, authoritative. I stayed in the hallway, watching as Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. He wiped his hands on a towel, glancing at me with a puzzled expression before heading to the door. When he opened it, the confusion turned to shock. 2 officers stood there, their faces unreadable. Richard Turner, one of them asked, his voice firm. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. "You're under arrest," the officer continued, stepping inside. "You have the right to remain silent." "What?" Richard finally found his voice, but it was shaking, weak. "There's been a mistake, I..." But the officers weren't listening. They cuffed him, reading him his rights as he struggled, his face a twisted mix of anger and disbelief. And that's when he saw me. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, he understood. His face contorted, the realization sinking in. He knew I had done this. He knew I had beaten him at his own game. But I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I met his gaze, holding it steady, and then I smiled. A small, satisfied smile. His face twisted in rage, but it was too late. They dragged him out of the house, his protests fading into the distance. I stood there, the weight of everything lifting off my shoulders. And as the door closed behind them, I whispered to myself, "I told you I'd win."